Okay, I wanted to talk about the linkage for a second in case you guys have never used this type of linkage. But I took the long heat shrink tube that they had and I cut it into sections about 11 to 12 millimeters in length. I took the Z-bends that they provided and I basically dipped the end of the carbon rod into my foam cure and then basically glued the straight end of the Z-bend to the side of the carbon rod and then covered it with the heat shrink and then used a heat gun to shrink it nice and tight. I made sure that when I did that the Z-bend is on the inside of the carbon rod because the carbon rod is 2 millimeters in diameter and I don't want it to bind up against the control horn. So I want to make sure that that 2 millimeter carbon rod is on the outside of the Z-bend so there won't be any chance of it binding against the control horn. I did that for the elevator and the rudder. One thing I wish they had done was instead of providing a standard Z-bend for the other end, and I'm going to attach the other end to the servo control arm and the provided Z-bends to the control horns on the elevator and the rudder. And the reason I'm doing that is because they did not provide a Z-bend for the other end that has a trim loop in it. And I like to be able to perform mechanical trim on the elevator, the rudder, the ailerons. So what I did was I just took a small paper clip, which is about the same diameter as the Z-bends. It's about 0.7, 0.8 millimeters. I tested it, it fits nice and snug in the holes that are in the servo control arms, and so I created my own Z-bend, my own trim loop, and then the straight section that's going to glue to the side of the carbon rod. Now when I attach these to the servo control arms, I'm going to have the trim loops facing upward so that there's no chance of it interfering with the linkage on the ailerons. Now I'm doing this for the elevator and for the rudder. Oddly enough, for the linkage on the ailerons, they have a trim loop built into the linkage. I don't know why they didn't provide that for the elevator and the rudder, but that would have been nice because then I wouldn't have had to take the time to fabricate my own. And I wanted to explain this on camera because when I'm putting this together, you're not going to be able to see it. These are very tiny parts and my hands are going to be in the way. So I wanted to try and explain exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it and how I was doing it. So I hope that helps. So I'm going to go ahead and get the radio connected to it, hook up a battery, bind to it, make sure that the servo is in the neutral position before I finalize the linkage at the servo arm. And I'm going to take a couple of spring clips and I'm going to clip the elevator and the rudder to make sure that they maintain a neutral position while I'm working on the linkage. And then if I need to adjust anything, I will have the trim loops to use to be able to mechanically adjust the position of the control surface rather than putting trim in the radio. And that way I'm not losing any of the movement on my control surface in either direction by doing the mechanical trim instead of trimming everything in the radio. Okay, so when we come back, I will show you what the linkage looks like after everything is attached. Okay, so I have my linkage set up for my rudder and for my elevator, complete with trim loops next to the servo control arms. So let me tilt this up so you can see it. Hopefully you can see everything. But so that's the way I fabricated those. Rather than using the standard Z-links on the other end, I fabricated my own Z-bends with the mechanical trim loop. That's what I like to have, so that's what I did. Okay, so now I'm ready to glue in the bottom wing. And like I said before, if you get the bottom wing straight, the top wing is going to be straight. So I'm using my grid here. I've got my wing along one of the horizontal lines. I think that's the easiest way to do it. Square up your wing, get something to support the bottom of your wing so that the fuselage is off of the table. I've got a couple sanding sponges underneath it. And then once I got my wing squared up, I squared up my fuselage.
and then took a pencil and marked my alignment lines on either side of the fuselage along the wing. I'm going to slide the wing out. I'm going to apply some of my foam cure glue, top and bottom, front edge, back edge, slide it back in, and then I'm going to use my square. Once I slide the wing back in and get it aligned, I'm going to use my square on the table and against the side of the fuselage to make sure the fuselage is completely vertical. And then I'm going to go ahead and use some hot glue to just tack it in place on both sides. Put a little tack of hot glue on the front and on the back on both sides. Let the hot glue cool so it will hold it in place, and then I can allow the foam cure to set up. And that way I'm not going to have to brace anything manually. The hot glue will hold it in place. Okay, so I have my bottom wing glued in. I have it tacked down with hot glue so it doesn't move. Got it completely vertical. Got it centered. Got the wing straightened up on it. And I just dry fitted the rest of it together with the struts and the top wing and with the connecting links to get an idea of how much is going to have to be trimmed off on those. The only thing that concerns me is the center piece of foam that goes through the center of the top wing. It's basically responsible for, holding everything else aligned. And mine's got a slight bend to it. So I think what I might do is take a scrap piece of either carbon rod or carbon slat and just make a slot in the front and the back and put in a piece of carbon rod or carbon slot to make sure that it holds that completely vertical and makes it as rigid as possible so that that top wing can't move from side to side, and put pressure on those struts that hold the wings together out here near the wing tips. Okay, so I did take a scrap piece of 2mm carbon rod. I drilled a hole down right in front of that center support and put it down inside of the center piece of foam about 10mm, and then added some foam cure to the end of the rod to insert it in the hole, and then also to the edge of that vertical support. And I've got everything clamped so it's perfectly straight. So I'm going to let that set up. I think putting that carbon rod in the front to make that more rigid and make sure that it's nice and vertical, I think will be plenty for it. I don't think I'll have to add one to the back. Okay, so before installing the struts on the wing, after the centerpiece gets set up with the carbon rod reinforcement, I thought this would be a good time, while those are out of our way, to go ahead and install the control horns for the ailerons and the linkage for the ailerons and get everything set up in a neutral position. I did have to use quite a bit of sub trim to get the servo arm centered, because you just couldn't, you couldn't get the control arm on straight. When the servo was centered, it was pretty well canted, so it required quite a bit of sub trim to square that up. I don't know why they don't make sure those are set up so that the gears and the servos are set up centered so that the control arms go on them at 90 degrees, but they never seem to do that. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and connect it, and we've got all of our control surfaces working in the right direction now. We've got our motor working. Okay, so there's our aileron, there's our elevator, there's our rudder, and there's our motor. So, except for setting up the dual rate and the expo, the radio and all the linkages are in place and everything's good to go. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention is don't forget to cut out your perforated area where your battery is going to sit, and you want it to be a snug fit. Now, since I don't have a 150 to 250 millimeter or milliamp hour LiPo that was stated in the specs, the smallest one I have is a 300, so it was a little large for the slot. So I ended up cutting out about 3 millimeters forward of the slot and about 3 millimeters additional material on the bottom of the slot to get my battery installed in there. Now, once I got that in, I went ahead and powered it up again. I put the prop on it with the prop saver,
I do not like this prop saver at all, and it seems to create a lot of vibration because the little aluminum hub that fits over the 1.5 millimeter shaft on the motor does not have a tall enough race, I don't think, to securely center that prop on there. The prop seems to want to lean to one side or the other. So I am not going to maiden it with the prop saver and the stock prop. I'm going to put a T-mount 5030 prop on it, and I'll provide a link to the T-mount 5030 props that I use with these micro motors that will take T-mount props. So do your battery slot, get your battery in there and get it slotted and with a nice snug fit before you put your struts on your bottom wing, because those are going to be in your way. Okay, let's get one of the struts on, and then I'll do the other side. Make sure you dry fit everything beforehand, right? You will know that. Put a little bit of glue on all the mating surfaces. Be conservative with your glue, it doesn't take much. Okay, and I've got the wing, the slots of the wing setting on top of those sanding sponges because I want to apply a little pressure to it. And I've got some wax paper in between the wing and the sanding sponge so that I don't, glue my strut onto my sanding sponge. I don't want to do that, right? Okay, so make sure you always have some scrap foam available. A little bit of hot glue. And I'm just going to hold that in place, square it up. Okay. And then I'll do the other side, and then we should be ready to put the main wing on. Okay, we're ready to install the top wing. I've already applied glue to all the struts mating surfaces. So I'm going to get the center positioned first. And then the struts. Okay, so we've got that in place. So what I'm going to do now, I have a length of wax paper ready to go. I am going to flip it over on its top. Oops. Put the wax paper down. First. Don't forget that. You don't want to glue to something you don't want glue to. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just apply a little bit of weight so that nothing wants to push out. There we go. I think that will do it. Yeah, I think that will work just fine. Okay, so I think that as soon as this is set up, we'll be able to install our linkage for the ailerons top and bottom. And we're getting very close to the point where we're going to be doing the glide test. So I'll see you after the glue sets up. Okay, so the plane is complete except for putting the prop on it and installing the landing gear. Now I haven't decided yet if I'm actually going to install the landing gear. I may not. But I'm certainly not going to install the landing gear until after I do the glide test with it, because I don't want to damage the landing gear if the CG is not good and it hits the ground hard. So the glue has been setting up for about 3 hours now. I went ahead and connected my linkage to the lower and upper wing aileron control surfaces. That was the last thing I had to do as far as control surfaces go. Everything's programmed, the motor's spinning the right way, the ailerons, elevator, rudder, everything looks really, really good. So a couple of tips. These are a couple of different things that I do when I'm building these type of planes, and I take a piece of heat shrink and I cut it open lengthways, you know, with a pair of scissors or utility knife, and I wrap the wires inside the piece of heat shrink, and then I use transparent tape to affix that to the fuselage. I think that looks a lot better, and it looks neater, and it keeps all of your wires bundled up so they don't get in the way. For the receiver, I cut a piece of double-sided sticky tape and cut it the same size as the receiver, and I used that to affix it to the fuselage. And then for the motor wires, I just used some transparent tape to tie those down to the fuselage. So all in all, I think the build came out pretty good. I think everything looks pretty clean and well ordered and tidy, which is what I like. So I'm going to let the glue completely cure overnight. It requires about 12 hours to fully cure, and it's only been setting up for about 3. So I'm going to let the glue fully cure overnight, and then tomorrow, as long as it's not too windy, I will take it out and do the glide test on it. So this will complete part 2, and the build's complete basically except for the landing gear, and I'm not even sure if I'm going to put landing gear on it. We'll see about that. But in the next video, we will definitely be taking it out and doing the maiden flight. I'll have the CG sorted out tomorrow from the glide test, or the next opportunity to perform the glide test, I will have the CG worked out on it and have it ready to go up in the air. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the air.